When Officer Patricia Williams kissed her daughter goodbye that November morning in 1985, she had no idea it would be their final embrace. For nearly 2 decades, her family fought against a system that seemed to forget she ever existed. Another missing person case filed away, another family left without answers. But what authorities overlooked, a road worker would discover beneath concrete and steel. Why did the investigation go cold so quickly? What did the department know that they never revealed? And what was buried under that overpass that would change everything? Today we uncover the truth they tried to hide. Before we uncover this vanished story, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. It means a lot knowing we're exploring this mystery together with the respect it truly deserves. Patricia Williams was more than just a badge number. She was a dedicated police officer who took pride in serving her community and a loving mother who never missed tucking her 8-year-old daughter into bed. In November 1985, life moved at a different pace. People relied on landline phones, computers were rare, and missing person cases often went unsolved simply because the tools we have today didn't exist. Patricia had built a routine around her work schedule and family time. She was known for her punctuality and reliability. Her fellow officers respected her dedication, and her neighbors admired how she balanced being a single mom with the demands of police work. She lived in a modest apartment where she created a safe haven for herself and her daughter. Every morning she would make breakfast, pack her daughter's lunch, and drive her to school before heading to her shift. But something was different about this particular Tuesday morning. Patricia clocked in for her shift that November day just like any other. She had patrol duties covering the south side of the city, an area she knew well from months of working the same beat. Her sergeant assigned her routine calls, nothing that seemed dangerous or unusual. She handled a minor traffic accident around noon, helped an elderly woman who had locked herself out of her car, and wrote a few parking tickets. Her radio chatter was normal throughout the day. She grabbed lunch at a diner she frequented, where the waitress remembered seeing her around 1 p.m. Patricia mentioned she was looking forward to helping her daughter with a school project that evening. She had planned to stop by the grocery store after her shift to pick up supplies for the project. Her last radio check-in was at 3:45 p.m., reporting she was heading to investigate a minor disturbance call. The call seemed routine, nothing that would typically require backup. She had no idea that someone was already watching her every move. When Patricia's shift ended at 4 p.m., her daughter expected her home by 4:30 like always. The little girl had been excited all day about working on her school project with Mom. By 5 p.m., she started watching from the living room window. By 6 p.m., real worry set in. This wasn't like her mother at all. Patricia was never late without calling, especially when it involved her daughter. The girl called her grandmother, who immediately sensed something was wrong. Patricia's mother knew her daughter's habits better than anyone. She called Patricia's work partner, who said Patricia had left the station on time. They started calling local hospitals, thinking maybe there had been an accident. Friends and neighbors joined the search, driving around looking for Patricia's patrol car. Everyone who knew Patricia understood that she would never voluntarily leave her daughter waiting and wondering. By midnight, everyone knew something terrible had happened. The missing person report was filed the next morning, but the response wasn't what the family expected. Patricia's mother had to push hard just to get the police to take the report seriously. Some officers suggested that Patricia might have just needed a break from her responsibilities. They implied that single mothers sometimes just walked away from their lives. This attitude infuriated Patricia's family, who knew better than anyone how devoted she was to her daughter. The initial search was limited and seemed half-hearted. Officers checked her usual patrol routes and interviewed a few co-workers, but there was no sense of urgency. Her family organized their own search parties, posting flyers around the neighborhood and checking with local businesses. They offered what little money they had as a reward for information. The first 24 hours are crucial in any missing person case, but those precious hours were slipping away while bureaucracy moved slowly. But the police response wasn't what the family expected. When a police officer goes missing, departments usually mobilize every available resource. The Blue Brotherhood typically closes ranks to protect one of their own. Press conferences are held, federal agencies get involved, and the community rallies around the thin blue line. Patricia's case should have triggered this kind of response, but it didn't. There were no press conferences in those first crucial days. The FBI wasn't contacted despite Patricia being a law enforcement officer. Fellow officers seemed strangely distant when family members asked for help. Some wouldn't even return phone calls from Patricia's mother. The police union, which should have been advocating for one of their members, remained largely silent. The lack of support from her own department puzzled and hurt Patricia's family. They couldn't understand why Patricia's colleagues weren't moving heaven and earth to find her. Her daughter kept asking why Daddy's police friends weren't helping Mommy. Yet something about this case was being handled differently. Despite the lukewarm official response, community volunteers organized search parties throughout the first week. Patricia's church congregation, neighbors, and even strangers who had heard about the case joined the effort. They combed through parks, vacant lots, and wooded areas within a 20-mile radius of where Patricia was last seen. Local businesses donated food and supplies for the volunteers. Radio stations broadcasted appeals for information. The searches were methodical, but hampered by the lack of police resources and expertise. Volunteers lacked access to specialized equipment and training that professional search teams would have. They followed up on every tip, no matter how far-fetched it seemed. Some volunteers worked around the clock, sleeping in their cars between search shifts. The community's response showed just how much Patricia meant to the people she served. Then investigators found her abandoned patrol car. Patricia's patrol car was discovered 3 days after she disappeared, parked behind an abandoned warehouse about 15 miles from her last known location. The car was locked, and there were no obvious signs of damage to the exterior. The keys were missing, which was unusual since police officers typically secure their vehicles differently than civilians. Inside the car, Patricia's radio was turned off, her logbook was missing several pages, and her service weapon was gone. These details should have been major red flags to investigators. Her purse was still in the car, but her wallet was missing from inside it. There were no signs of a struggle inside the vehicle, which confused investigators. The car's location wasn't random. It was in an area known for drug activity and other crimes. Someone had deliberately chosen this spot to abandon the vehicle, but what they found inside would raise more questions than answers. The evidence from Patricia's patrol car didn't tell a clear story. Fingerprints found in the vehicle included some that didn't belong to Patricia or any known police personnel. The car's mileage indicated it had been driven much further than Patricia's assigned patrol route would account for. Most puzzling was the condition of Patricia's equipment. Her handcuffs were missing, her flashlight was found in the back seat instead of its proper location, and her citation book had pages torn out. The lab found traces of an unknown substance on the driver's seat that they couldn't immediately identify. Patricia's coffee cup was still in the cup holder, half full and cold, suggesting she had left the vehicle quickly. The positioning of the driver's seat had been adjusted, indicating someone taller than Patricia had driven the car. These inconsistencies should have provided clear direction for the investigation. Someone was definitely not telling the whole truth. As the days turned into weeks without finding Patricia, her family's desperation grew. Her 8-year-old daughter couldn't understand why Mommy wasn't coming home. Patricia's mother became the child's primary caregiver while also trying to keep the search effort alive. They appeared on local television news programs, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. Patricia's daughter held up her mother's photograph and asked the community to help bring her Mommy home. These appearances were heartbreaking, but necessary to keep public attention focused on the case. The family offered to mortgage their home to increase the reward money. They contacted psychics, private investigators, and anyone else who might help. Church groups held prayer vigils for Patricia's safe return. The family's pain was visible to everyone who met them during this time, but their pleas seemed to fall on deaf ears. Local news stations initially covered Patricia's disappearance extensively. Her story was featured on the evening news for several consecutive days, and newspapers ran articles about the missing officer. The story had all the elements that typically generate sustained media attention: a dedicated single mother, a police officer, and a mysterious disappearance. Community members were interviewed about their shock and concern. Local politicians made statements about supporting the search effort. Radio talk shows discussed the case and encouraged listeners to call in tips. Missing person flyers with Patricia's photograph appeared throughout the city. The story even attracted attention from regional news outlets who sent reporters to cover the case. A reward fund grew as local businesses and individuals contributed money. The media coverage seemed to be building momentum that would help solve the case. Then suddenly, the media attention began to fade. The first major disappointment came when investigators ruled out several promising leads. A witness who claimed to have seen Patricia arguing with someone in a parking lot recanted their statement. Another tip about Patricia being spotted at a bus station turned out to be a case of mistaken identity. A phone call claiming to know where Patricia was being held led to an empty, abandoned building. Each false lead was devastating for the family, who would get their hopes up only to have them crushed again. The investigators seemed to be grasping at straws rather than following a coherent investigative strategy. Resources were being wasted on tips that hadn't been properly vetted before being pursued. The family began to lose confidence in the investigation's competence. Time was passing, and every day that went by without finding Patricia made her safe return less likely. Investigators were missing something crucial. Behind the scenes, the police department was dealing with other pressures that affected Patricia's case. The city was facing budget cuts that limited overtime pay for investigations. Several high-profile cases were competing for detective resources and media attention. There was political pressure to solve cases that generated more public outrage or media coverage. Patricia's case, while tragic, wasn't generating the sustained attention that kept it at the top of the priority list. Some veteran detectives were approaching retirement and weren't eager to take on complex cases that might not be solved quickly. Departmental politics also played a role, with different supervisors having different opinions about how resources should be allocated. The department was also dealing with corruption allegations in other divisions, which created a defensive atmosphere. These internal issues shouldn't have affected the search for a missing officer, but they did. But was someone actively working against finding Patricia? After 6 months of investigation, Patricia's case was officially moved to the cold case files. The active investigation was scaled back dramatically, with only one detective assigned to follow up on new leads as they came in. This decision devastated Patricia's family, who felt like the system was abandoning their loved one. The detective assigned to maintain the case was already handling dozens of other cold cases, so Patricia's file became just one among many. Regular search efforts stopped, and media coverage became practically non-existent. The reward money remained available, but without ongoing publicity, few people remembered the case existed. Patricia's family was told to be patient and that the case would be solved eventually, but those words felt empty. The official investigation might have stopped, but someone kept digging. The years that followed were torture for Patricia's family. Every holiday, birthday, and anniversary was a painful reminder of her absence. Patricia's daughter grew up without knowing what happened to her mother, always wondering if she might someday walk through the door. Patricia's mother aged dramatically during this period the stress of not knowing taking a visible toll on her health. They held memorial services on the anniversary of Patricia's disappearance, hoping to keep her memory alive and generate new leads. The family moved several times, partly because staying in the same place was too painful, and partly because they received occasional threatening phone calls telling them to stop looking for Patricia. Private investigators were hired and fired as the family's limited resources ran out. Each investigator would make initial progress, but eventually hit the same walls that had stopped the police. But in the background, something was being covered up. The truth about why Patricia's investigation went cold so quickly was more sinister than her family could have imagined. Internal documents that wouldn't surface for years showed that key evidence had been deliberately mishandled from the very beginning. Witness interviews that should have been conducted within days of Patricia's disappearance were delayed for weeks, allowing memories to fade and stories to change. The officer who was supposed to process Patricia's patrol car for evidence took nearly a week to do so, claiming he was waiting for the proper lab technician to be available. This delay allowed crucial forensic evidence to be compromised or lost entirely. Phone records that could have shown Patricia's communications in her final hours were requested but never properly analyzed. Several people who called in tips were never interviewed, and their contact information was somehow lost. These weren't accidents or bureaucratic mistakes. Someone with badge and authority wanted Patricia to stay missing. The corruption that Patricia had stumbled upon went deeper than anyone realized at the time. She had been working cases that intersected with a network of officers who were taking bribes from drug dealers and other criminals. Patricia's reputation as an honest cop made her dangerous to this network. She had started asking questions about why certain arrests never resulted in convictions, and why some known criminals seemed to operate with impunity in her patrol area. Patricia had documented inconsistencies in arrest reports and evidence handling that suggested some of her colleagues were compromised. She had begun keeping her own notes about suspicious activities she observed, notes that disappeared after her disappearance. Her supervisors knew about her concerns because she had filed preliminary reports about what she was seeing. The corruption wasn't limited to street-level officers. It reached into the detective division and possibly higher. Patricia had stumbled onto something that could destroy careers. Looking back, Patricia's family remembered changes in her behavior during the weeks before she disappeared. She had seemed more worried than usual, checking her locks multiple times before bed and looking over her shoulder when they were out together. Patricia had told her mother that she felt like she was being watched, but she attributed it to the stress of police work. She had received a few hang-up phone calls at home, which she reported to her supervisor, but which were never investigated. Patricia had also mentioned to a neighbor that she was concerned about some of the people she worked with, though she didn't provide specifics. Her daughter remembered Mommy seeming scared sometimes, especially when the phone rang at night. Patricia had even changed their daily routine slightly, taking different routes to and from work and school. She had started carrying her off-duty weapon more frequently, something she had rarely done before. She tried to protect herself, but it wasn't enough. The specific information that sealed Patricia's fate was her discovery of a drug trafficking operation that involved several police officers providing protection and inside information to dealers. Patricia had unknowingly stumbled onto this network when she arrested a dealer who tried to name drop police contacts to get out of trouble. Instead of dismissing the dealer's claims like corrupt officers would have, Patricia started investigating. She discovered that evidence from drug arrests was sometimes going missing from the evidence room. She found patterns in patrol schedules that seemed designed to give certain criminals advance warning of raids or increased police presence. Patricia had identified at least 3 officers who she suspected were involved, and she was building cases against them. She had been planning to present her findings to internal affairs, but she needed more solid evidence first. The corrupt officers discovered her investigation before she could expose them. This secret was dangerous enough to kill a cop. The cover-up began immediately after Patricia's disappearance. The officers involved in the corruption knew they had to control the investigation to protect themselves. Key evidence was lost or contaminated. Witnesses were intimidated or discredited. The investigation was steered away from areas that might expose the corruption network. False leads were created to waste investigative resources and time. Patricia's personal notes and files were removed from her desk and locker before internal affairs could secure them. The corrupt officers used their knowledge of police procedures to stay ahead of any legitimate investigation efforts. They had access to all investigation reports and could adjust their cover-up accordingly. Media contacts were used to downplay the story and reduce public pressure for answers. The machinery of bureaucracy was used to make the case disappear into a maze of paperwork and procedure, but they couldn't control everything forever. Over time, small inconsistencies in the official story began to surface. Witnesses started remembering details differently than they had initially reported. Officers who had been interviewed early in the case began contradicting their previous statements when questioned again years later. Some evidence that had been reported as lost or destroyed was found misfiled in other cases. Patricia's family hired a private investigator who noticed discrepancies in the official timeline that had never been addressed. The investigator found that some witness statements had been altered after they were initially taken. Phone records that supposedly didn't exist were found in a different filing system. The private investigator also discovered that Patricia had made copies of some of her corruption evidence and hidden them in a safety deposit box, but the key had never been found. These inconsistencies suggested either gross incompetence or deliberate manipulation of the investigation. The truth was starting to leak out. Patricia's daughter never stopped believing she would find out what happened to her mother. As she grew into adulthood, she developed skills and resources that her 8-year-old self couldn't have imagined. She studied criminal justice in college, partly to understand the system that had failed her mother. She learned about investigative techniques, evidence preservation, and legal procedures. She also developed a network of contacts in law enforcement who were sympathetic to her cause. Unlike her grandmother, who had been intimidated by the police bureaucracy, Patricia's daughter knew how to navigate the system and demand answers. She filed Freedom of Information requests, attended city council meetings, and kept Patricia's case in the public eye through social media and community activism. She had inherited her mother's determination and sense of justice. She was about to uncover what trained detectives had missed. Advances in technology during the 1990s and early 2000s brought new hope to cold cases like Patricia's. DNA testing became more sophisticated and could extract profiles from smaller samples. Computer databases allowed for better information sharing between jurisdictions. Digital mapping technology could analyze crime patterns in ways that weren't possible in 1985. Cold case units were established in many police departments, staffed with experienced detectives who specialized in reviewing old cases with fresh eyes. These units had access to resources and techniques that hadn't existed during the original investigations. Crime scene reconstruction technology could recreate scenarios based on available evidence. Psychological profiling had also advanced significantly, allowing investigators to better understand criminal behavior patterns. All of these technological advances would eventually be brought to bear on Patricia's case. These new tools would reveal something shocking. A veteran crime reporter who had covered Patricia's disappearance in 1985 never forgot about the case. As he approached retirement, he decided to revisit some of the stories that had always bothered him. Patricia's case was at the top of his list because of the strange way it had been handled. The reporter used his decades of experience and contacts to dig deeper than he had been able to in 1985. He filed numerous Freedom of Information requests and obtained documents that had never been released to the public. He interviewed retired officers who were now willing to speak more freely about what they had observed. The reporter also discovered that Patricia's case file had been purged of several documents that should have been permanent parts of the record. His investigation uncovered a pattern of evidence tampering and witness intimidation that hadn't been apparent 20 years earlier. What they found in those files would change everything. The breakthrough came when a retired police officer finally decided to speak out about what he had witnessed in 1985. This officer had been nearing retirement when Patricia disappeared and hadn't wanted to jeopardize his pension by making waves. But guilt had eaten at him for years, and he eventually contacted Patricia's daughter through an intermediary. The officer revealed that he had overheard conversations between supervisors about limiting the investigation into Patricia's disappearance. He had seen evidence bags from Patricia's case being removed from the evidence room by officers who shouldn't have had access to them. He also knew about threats that had been made against officers who asked too many questions about the case. This whistleblower had kept detailed notes about what he observed, hoping someday to find the courage to come forward. Their revelation would blow the case wide open. Based on the whistleblower's information, a new team of investigators was assigned to review Patricia's case. These detectives had no connection to the original investigation and no loyalty to any of the people who might have been involved in a cover-up. They approached the case with fresh eyes and modern investigative techniques. Within weeks, they identified numerous procedural errors and suspicious gaps in the original investigation. They found evidence that had been improperly stored or mislabeled, making it difficult to use. They also discovered that several key witnesses had never been properly interviewed, despite being noted in the original case files. The new team interviewed retired officers who provided information that had never been documented. They immediately spotted what had been deliberately overlooked. The new investigation followed financial trails that had been ignored in 1985. Banking records showed unusual cash deposits and withdrawals by several officers around the time of Patricia's disappearance. These financial patterns suggested that money was changing hands to ensure silence and cooperation in the cover-up. The investigators also discovered that Patricia had been building a case against officers who were skimming money from drug arrests and taking bribes from dealers. Her investigation had focused on following the money, and she had documented financial discrepancies that proved corruption. The corrupt officers had been living beyond their means, but this hadn't been noticed or investigated in 1985. Credit card records showed suspicious purchases and travel that didn't match the officers' reported activities. The money led straight to someone with everything to lose. The investigation also uncovered a network of criminal informants who had known about Patricia's fate but had been too terrified to speak. These informants revealed that word on the street in 1985 was that Patricia had been killed because she was getting too close to police corruption. Several informants independently provided similar accounts of what they had heard from their criminal contacts. They described a plan to eliminate Patricia that had been discussed openly among criminals who were working with corrupt police. The informants had never been interviewed during the original investigation, despite being known to work regularly with police. Some had tried to provide information, but were turned away or threatened. Others had been too scared to come forward because they feared for their own safety. They all pointed to the same shocking conclusion. Meanwhile, physical evidence from Patricia's case was being re-examined using modern forensic techniques. DNA testing on evidence from her patrol car revealed genetic material from someone who had never been identified or questioned in the original investigation. Fiber analysis of Patricia's uniform revealed traces of materials that weren't consistent with her normal work environment. Hair samples found in her car were matched to someone who shouldn't have had access to the vehicle. Fingerprint evidence that had been dismissed as inconclusive in 1985 was enhanced using new techniques and matched to a known individual. The forensic evidence was building a clear picture of what had happened to Patricia and who was responsible. The evidence told a completely different story. As the new investigation progressed, it became clear that the conspiracy to cover up Patricia's murder involved more people than originally suspected. The network included not just the officers directly involved in corruption, but also supervisors who helped with the cover-up, evidence technicians who lost or contaminated crucial evidence, and administrators who buried reports and reassigned personnel to limit exposure. The conspiracy reached into multiple divisions of the police department and involved both uniformed officers and detectives. Some participants were actively involved in Patricia's murder, while others simply helped hide the crime after the fact. The web of corruption and cover-up was more extensive than anyone had imagined. But they hadn't counted on one crucial mistake. The department's internal investigation had uncovered the truth about Patricia's fate within weeks of her disappearance. A secret report detailed exactly what had happened to her, who was responsible, and how the cover-up was being orchestrated. This report identified Patricia's killers and provided evidence that could have led to immediate arrests and convictions. The report documented Patricia's investigation into police corruption and explained why she had been targeted for elimination. It included witness statements, physical evidence, and financial records that proved the case beyond any doubt. However, this report was classified at the highest levels and hidden from public view. The decision was made to sacrifice Patricia's life and her family's need for justice to protect the reputation of the police department. They knew exactly what happened to Patricia from day one. The secret internal report revealed that Patricia had been lured to a meeting by corrupt officers who claimed to have information about the corruption she was investigating. She had been killed during this meeting when it became clear she couldn't be bought or intimidated into silence. Her body had been disposed of immediately, and her patrol car had been moved to create confusion about the timeline and location of her disappearance. The report named 3 officers as directly responsible for Patricia's murder and identified several others who had participated in the cover-up. It also detailed how evidence had been destroyed or tampered with to prevent the case from being solved. The report had been written by an honest investigator who was later transferred to another division and told never to speak about the case. This report contained the killer's identity. The decision to bury the internal report came from the highest levels of the police department and city government. Officials argued that exposing the corruption and murder would destroy public confidence in law enforcement and potentially lead to civil unrest. They claimed that the greater good required sacrificing Patricia's case to maintain social order. The officials who made this decision were more concerned about their careers and the department's reputation than about justice for Patricia or her family. They convinced themselves that Patricia was already dead and that destroying more lives wouldn't bring her back. This cold calculation ignored the ongoing suffering of Patricia's family and the message it sent that police officers could literally get away with murder. They chose their careers over justice for Patricia. The psychological toll of keeping such a massive secret affected many of the people involved over the years. Several officers developed drinking problems or suffered from depression as guilt ate away at them. Some left the police force entirely, unable to continue working in an environment where they knew murderers were walking free. Others threw themselves into their work, trying to make up for their silence by solving other cases. A few officers sought therapy or counseling, though they couldn't reveal the real source of their guilt. Marriages and relationships suffered as the stress of keeping the secret took its toll. The corruption that started with taking bribes had evolved into something much darker and many officers realized they were in too deep to back out. But guilt has a way of eating at people. Over the years, there were numerous opportunities to solve Patricia's case that were deliberately ignored or sabotaged. Tips that came in were never properly followed up, even when they pointed directly at the truth. Evidence that surfaced was quickly buried or discredited. Witnesses who tried to come forward were intimidated or ignored. Technology advances that could have solved the case were never applied to Patricia's evidence. New investigative techniques were used on other cold cases, but not on Patricia's. Each missed opportunity represented a conscious choice to continue the cover-up rather than seek justice. Some opportunities were missed due to incompetence, but most were missed because solving Patricia's case would have exposed the corruption and cover-up. Each missed opportunity was a choice to let Patricia down. The tipping point came when new leadership took over the police department and the mayor's office. These officials had no connection to the original cover-up and no investment in protecting the people involved. When Patricia's daughter and the crime reporter presented their evidence of the cover-up, the new leadership was horrified by what they learned. They immediately ordered a complete review of the case and assigned resources to investigate not just Patricia's murder, but the subsequent cover-up as well. Legal pressure from Patricia's family, who had hired attorneys threatening wrongful death lawsuits, also forced action. The statute of limitations had run out on most of the corruption charges, but murder has no statute of limitations. Finally, someone with power decided to seek the truth. In 2003, a routine highway construction project was expanding an overpass that had been built in the early 1990s. The construction crew was working on improving drainage under the overpass when they encountered an area where the concrete seemed different from the rest of the structure. The workers initially thought they had found a construction defect or settling issue that needed to be addressed. The project involved digging deeper than usual because new environmental regulations required improved water runoff systems. The location was in a remote area where the highway crossed over a dry creek bed that only filled during heavy rains. Traffic noise from the highway above would have masked any sounds from below during the original construction. The area was rarely visited except by construction crews and occasional maintenance workers. Nobody expected what they would find underneath. The construction worker who made the discovery was operating a small excavator when he noticed something unusual in the soil. At first, he thought he had hit a large piece of construction debris or an old pipe. But as he carefully cleared away more dirt, he realized he was looking at something much more disturbing. The worker immediately stopped his equipment and called his supervisor to the scene. The supervisor took one look and knew they needed to contact the police immediately. The construction site was quickly secured and detectives were called to investigate. The area was treated as a potential crime scene, with access restricted to authorized personnel only. Heavy equipment was moved away from the discovery site to preserve any additional evidence that might be buried nearby. What he saw made him immediately call the police. After 18 years buried under concrete and steel, Patricia's remains were finally found. The condition of the remains made identification challenging, but dental records and DNA testing confirmed what everyone suspected. Patricia's police badge was found with her remains, along with her service weapon and handcuffs. These items had been left with her body, possibly as a message or simply because removing them would have been too risky for the killers. The location where she was buried was consistent with the timeline investigators had developed for her disappearance. Environmental conditions under the overpass had actually helped preserve some evidence that would have been lost if the body had been buried in soil. Fabric from Patricia's uniform was still identifiable, and some personal items had survived the years underground. The remains told a story of Patricia's final moments. Forensic analysis of Patricia's remains revealed crucial information about how and when she had died. The cause of death was determined to be gunshot wounds, with ballistics evidence linking the bullets to her own service weapon. This indicated that Patricia had been killed with her own gun, probably after being disarmed by her attackers. The forensic pathologist could determine the approximate time of death based on the condition of the remains and other factors. Evidence suggested that Patricia had been killed shortly after her disappearance, not held captive for any extended period. There were also signs that she had fought back against her attackers, with defensive wounds visible on her bones. The angle and location of the gunshot wounds provided information about the circumstances of her death. The forensics revealed something nobody expected. The location where Patricia's body was found was significant for several reasons. It was remote enough that construction or burial activities wouldn't be easily observed, but accessible enough that someone could transport a body there without difficulty. The area was also familiar to local police officers who would have known about its isolation and lack of regular foot traffic. The timing of Patricia's burial coincided with the construction of the overpass, suggesting that her killers had inside knowledge of the construction schedule. This would have allowed them to bury the body and then have it permanently concealed when the concrete was poured for the overpass foundation. The location choice showed planning and familiarity with both police procedures and construction activities. Only someone with inside knowledge would choose this place. The discovery of Patricia's remains officially reopened her case and brought renewed media attention to her story. The investigation was assigned to a task force of detectives from multiple jurisdictions to ensure objectivity and prevent any conflicts of interest. Patricia's family finally had confirmation of what they had feared for 18 years, but they also had hope that justice might finally be served. The media coverage was extensive, with national news outlets picking up the story of the police officer whose murder had been covered up by her own department. Public outrage over the case was intense, with community members demanding accountability from police leadership. The discovery also vindicated Patricia's family, who had never stopped insisting that she hadn't simply walked away from her life. But finding Patricia was just the beginning. With Patricia's remains recovered, investigators could finally piece together a complete timeline of her final day. The forensic evidence from her body matched witness statements that had been ignored or suppressed during the original investigation. The location of her burial site helped investigators understand how her patrol car had ended up where it was found. Phone records from 1985 that had been stored in archives suddenly became relevant again and provided crucial timing information. The investigation team also re-interviewed people who had been questioned in 1985, finding that many were now willing to provide information they had been too scared to share before. Witnesses who had been children in 1985 were now adults who better understood what they had seen. Everything was finally starting to make sense. Based on all the evidence that had been gathered over the years, investigators developed a profile of Patricia's killer. The perpetrator had to be someone with detailed knowledge of police procedures and access to information about Patricia's investigation into corruption. They had to know Patricia well enough to lure her to a meeting without raising her suspicions. The killer also had access to construction information that allowed them to choose the perfect burial location. They demonstrated knowledge of forensic procedures, taking steps to delay the discovery of Patricia's patrol car and contaminate evidence. The killer had enough influence within the police department to manipulate the subsequent investigation and cover-up. All of these factors pointed to someone within law enforcement who had been directly threatened by Patricia's corruption investigation. The killer had been hiding in plain sight. As investigators closed in on their suspects, they found that several of the officers involved in the original corruption had left the police force shortly after Patricia's disappearance. Some had taken early retirement, while others had transferred to different departments or left law enforcement entirely. A few had died in the intervening years, taking their secrets with them, but others were still alive and could be held accountable for their crimes. The investigators carefully built cases against each suspect, knowing they would only get one chance to bring charges after so many years. They gathered financial records, witness statements, and physical evidence that linked specific individuals to Patricia's murder and the subsequent cover-up. They were finally ready to make an arrest. The discovery under the overpass revealed not just Patricia's remains, but also additional evidence that had been buried with her. Her personal notebook, which contained details of her corruption investigation, had been placed in a plastic bag that protected it from moisture and decay. This notebook contained names, dates, and specific allegations that corroborated everything investigators had learned about the corruption network. Patricia's service weapon was found at the scene, along with ballistics evidence that would prove crucial in prosecuting her killers. There were also personal items that Patricia's family thought they would never see again, including a ring that had belonged to her grandmother. But the biggest shock was finding evidence that Patricia had been wearing a wire during her final meeting, and the recording device was still with her remains. But the biggest revelation was still to come. The physical evidence recovered from Patricia's burial site provided the final pieces needed to solve her case. DNA evidence from her remains matched samples that had been collected from her patrol car and other locations. Fiber evidence linked her clothing to materials found in vehicles owned by the suspects. Most importantly, fingerprint evidence from items buried with Patricia matched individuals who had never been properly investigated in the original case. The ballistics evidence showed that Patricia had been killed with her own weapon, but also revealed that multiple shots had been fired, suggesting either multiple shooters or a prolonged struggle. Soil samples from the burial site contained trace evidence that could be matched to locations where the suspects lived and worked. The evidence pointed to someone shocking. After years of investigation and months of building an airtight case, police finally arrested the person responsible for Patricia's murder. The arrest came as a shock to many in the community, including some police officers who had worked alongside the killer for years without suspecting their involvement. The suspect was a fellow police officer who had been part of the corruption network that Patricia was investigating. During interrogation, the suspect initially denied any involvement, but eventually broke down when confronted with the overwhelming physical evidence. The confession revealed details about Patricia's final hours and the panic among corrupt officers when they realized how much she knew about their activities. The arrest brought a sense of relief to Patricia's family, but also raised new questions about how many people had been involved in covering up the crime. The trial of Patricia's killer was a media sensation that exposed the depth of corruption within the police department. Prosecutors presented evidence of the conspiracy to kill Patricia and cover up her murder, showing how multiple officers had participated in various aspects of the crime. Witness testimony revealed the fear and intimidation that had kept people silent for nearly 2 decades. The defendant's attempts to blame other officers or claim self-defense fell apart under cross-examination. Expert witnesses explained the forensic evidence and how it proved the prosecution's case beyond reasonable doubt. The jury heard testimony from Patricia's family about the impact her loss had on their lives. After deliberating for 2 days, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all charges, including first-degree murder and conspiracy. Patricia's family finally had their answers. The jury's verdict brought a sense of closure, but Patricia's legacy extended far beyond the courtroom. Her case exposed systemic problems within the police department that demanded immediate reform. New protocols were established for handling internal corruption investigations, ensuring that cases like Patricia's could never again be buried by the very people sworn to seek justice. The department implemented mandatory rotation policies for internal affairs investigators to prevent the development of corrupt relationships that had plagued Patricia's case. Patricia's daughter, now a grown woman who had spent most of her life seeking answers, finally found the peace that had eluded her family for nearly 2 decades. She established a foundation in her mother's name dedicated to supporting families of murdered police officers and advocating for transparency in law enforcement investigations. The foundation also provided scholarships for young people pursuing careers in criminal justice, ensuring that Patricia's commitment to honest police work would inspire future generations. The case also led to the creation of specialized cold case units with enhanced oversight and accountability measures. These units were given access to advanced forensic technologies and were staffed with investigators who had no connections to the original cases they reviewed. The Patricia Williams protocols, as they became known, required external oversight for any case involving the disappearance or death of a law enforcement officer. But even with justice finally served, some questions lingered in the minds of those who had followed Patricia's story. How many other cases had been compromised by the same corruption network? Were there other families who had been denied justice to protect the reputation of those in power? The investigation had revealed the tip of an iceberg, and many wondered what other secrets remained buried beneath the surface of institutional cover-ups. The construction site where Patricia's remains were discovered became an unofficial memorial, with community members leaving flowers and remembrances at the location. The Highway Department eventually installed a small plaque acknowledging Patricia's service and sacrifice, though it couldn't capture the full scope of her courage or the injustice she had endured. Travelers passing over that stretch of highway rarely knew they were crossing ground that had held such a tragic secret for so many years. Patricia's case also highlighted the importance of persistent journalism and family advocacy in seeking justice. The crime reporter who had never forgotten her story became a symbol of the media's crucial role in holding institutions accountable. His investigation had shown that sometimes the most important stories are the ones that officials want to keep buried. The partnership between Patricia's determined daughter and the relentless reporter demonstrated how ordinary citizens could challenge powerful systems and demand truth. The officers who had participated in the cover-up but were not directly involved in Patricia's murder faced their own reckonings. Some lost their pensions, others faced criminal charges for obstruction of justice, and many carried the weight of their silence for the rest of their lives. The blue wall of silence that had protected Patricia's killers ultimately crumbled under the weight of evidence and changing times. The technology that had finally helped solve Patricia's case continued to evolve, bringing hope to other cold case families. DNA databases expanded, forensic techniques improved, and digital tools made it easier to analyze complex criminal networks. Patricia's case became a teaching example in police academies and criminal justice programs, illustrating both the dangers of corruption and the importance of never giving up on seeking justice. For Patricia's family, the conviction of her killer marked the end of one chapter, but not the end of their commitment to her memory. They continued to speak at police training seminars, sharing Patricia's story to inspire ethical behavior among new officers. They also worked with victims' rights organizations to support other families facing similar struggles with unsolved cases and institutional indifference. The community that had supported Patricia's family throughout their long search for answers celebrated the resolution of her case, but also reflected on the broader implications of what had been revealed. Trust in law enforcement, already fragile in many communities, required careful rebuilding through transparency and accountability. Patricia's case became a catalyst for community policing initiatives that emphasized citizen oversight and open communication. The overpass where Patricia had been buried was eventually renamed in her honor, ensuring that her sacrifice would not be forgotten by future generations. The dedication ceremony brought together hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by Patricia's story. from the construction worker who had found her remains to the officers who had finally brought her killers to justice. Patricia Williams had entered police work to serve and protect her community, never imagining that her greatest threat would come from within her own department. Her courage in investigating corruption had cost her everything, but her legacy lived on in the reforms and changes that her case had inspired. The 8-year-old girl who had waited by the window for her mother to come home had grown into a woman who ensured that Patricia's fight for justice continued even after death. The case files from Patricia's murder were sealed and archived, preserving the evidence and testimony for future researchers and law enforcement professionals to study. Her story became part of the historical record, a reminder of both the potential for corruption within institutions and the power of persistence in seeking truth. The investigation had taken nearly 2 decades to complete, but justice, though delayed, had finally been served. Patricia Williams was finally at peace, and her killer would never hurt anyone again. Her daughter could finally visit a gravesite and know that her mother's story had been told in full. The community could move forward with the knowledge that even the most powerful conspiracies could be exposed when brave people refused to accept silence as an answer. And somewhere, other families dealing with unsolved cases found hope in Patricia's story, knowing that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of eventually coming to light. Patricia's story reminds us that behind every missing person case lies a family desperate for answers and a community seeking justice. Her disappearance without a trace became one of those real-life mysteries that haunted everyone who knew her story. While Patricia vanished without explanation in 1985, her case proves that even the most mysterious disappearances can eventually be solved through persistence and courage. This true crime mystery shows us that disappeared persons cases, no matter how cold they become, deserve continued investigation. Patricia's story joins countless other unsolved missing person cases where families never stop searching for their vanished loved ones. Her case demonstrates that real unsolved mysteries require more than just hope. They demand action, accountability, and the refusal to let suspicious disappearances remain unexplained. If Patricia's story moved you, please subscribe for more disappearance stories and missing persons documentaries. Share this video to help other families dealing with unsolved disappearances know they're not alone in their search for answers.